Thank you all for being here today. Um, I think this is a really great and interesting format, but it's also a little challenging then to, to come up and say just a couple of words because I want to go pretty quickly into the questions. And as I understand, then what you'll do is raise your hand, and there are microphones. I'll come down to you with that. So, I think that, one reason that we're all here, I think, is because we have this interest in U.S.-China relations and are interested in hearing about, sort of a thoughtful discussion about the whole array of issues that are there, and including the issue raised in the last question about the kind of rhetoric, I think, especially in the previous administration, that fueled anti-Asian hatred, and that I think the temperature has been lowered a bit. And I think that's really important when we talk about, that kind of rhetoric, and in addition to actions, the impact that it has. What is so interesting that is very, very good of President Biden and President Xi Jinping to have their meeting just a couple of days before we're meeting here, because it was such an interesting and obvious effort, I think, by both leaders to lower the temperature a bit in the rhetoric around relations, to have a lengthy in-person meeting, because those, as Ambassador Huntsman said, those really matter. It wasn't, a sort of 20-minute read the 3 talking points kind of meeting, but obviously over 3 hours, with a solid team on both sides. That it seems from what, all the readouts are, that it really may have been an important step toward looking for the kinds of things that Ambassador Huntsman talked about, concrete ways to to address the issues that face our two countries, even while it wasn't some complete U-turn in terms of both sides looking at the relationship in sort of a strategic competition kind of way. And, just to summarize, and then I'll turn it over to questions. I mean, just in the days around that meeting, we also saw the John Kerry meet with China's climate envoy and try to get back to the kind of conversation that actually led through the breakthrough that led to the Paris Climate Agreement in 2015, where the United States and China, as sort of the biggest powers around that, were able to make some breakthrough. Can they do that in at COP27? That remains to be seen, but very publicly meeting. We saw Janet Yellen, as was mentioned, meeting with the head of China's central bank. We heard announcements that Secretary Blinken will be visiting. And those are all important because we have these other things, this implementation of the CHIPS Act, and a lot of discussion and concern over so there's the investment in semiconductors, so there's the U.S. business part of it, but what will it mean to have this sort of complete cutoff of, exports and manufacturing? So it remains to be seen how that will play out. That sort of very clear and very sort of hard line approach to that issue, in addition to the fact that most of the tariffs that were imposed in the previous administration have remained on. And so I think we, there's a lot that remains to be seen. I think the effort by both sides to lower the rhetoric on Taiwan is very important. The United States continues to raise issues around human rights, to refer to what's happening in Xinjiang province as genocide, but not to take sort of strong affirmative steps that would seem to follow on from such a declaration. So I think we are just at the beginning, really, with this administration of seeing where where they will take this sort of strategic decisions about China relations. Uh, and and I look forward to your questions about, either your thoughts about U.S.-China relations, or, and I cannot speak for Ambassador Huntsman, but if there's something that he raised that you would like to explore a little more, we can do that as well. I'm willing to take on whatever question you would like to bring up. So if you have a question, raise your hand, and then someone will bring a microphone down to you, please. Thanks.
Thank you, Dr. Curtin. I'm Stuart Mason. I'm the Chief Investment Officer here at the university, and we have a lot of investments in China throughout the endowment and so forth. And
Yeah.
I'm interested if you could expand a little bit on what you think is possible over the course of the next couple of years politically, as we see what is likely to become House of Representatives dominated by one party and the Senate by another. John Huntsman talked about improving bilateral relationships by people to people, and it feels like there's diametrically opposed ideas in Congress about how that ought to happen. So any thoughts on that would be helpful.
Yeah, I will be very honest that I thought he was a little more optimistic about what balance in Congress might bring about than I would ever be at this moment. And in the past, let's start with free trade. In the past, like a number of free trade agreements were brought about because though there was an element in each party that would come together and support the free trade agreements like NAFTA, or, we almost got there with TPP or with the EU. And it seems like it has become harder and harder and virtually impossible to hive off parts of the two parties and bring them together. So, and I suppose in terms of any big changes on legislation regarding investment, that can be good and bad, right? So I would be very skeptical that there could be, he called for, hoped for, I don't think he was being unrealistic, but he said it would be great if we could see the U.S. joining the configuration of the TPP, but I don't think that will happen. On the other hand, because of the divisions within Congress and the party, I don't think, for example, there are those who would want to really further clamp down, and I think that similarly, there would be no unification within Congress to really take further steps. U.S. investment overall in China is still really significant, and China is still our largest trading market. And I notice they use the word market rather than country because we use also the EU, which is a market. But I think that this administration will probably not go to Congress to ask for really much more, say, restrictive or difficult things with regard to investment, because they know that American business needs that. But what I'm afraid could happen is we could see committees in the House, and it looks now like the House definitely will be Republican. We could see committees that rhetorically are very anti-China, and that could make companies nervous about that. So rather than looking at legislation, we may be looking at committee chairs who use that to create an atmosphere that creates uncertainty. So, I think we just don't know where we're going yet with all that.
Hey, Dr. Curtin. My name is Dong Lin Lang. Thanks for organizing the events here. A lot of wisdom, a lot of common sense that I hear today. Of course, I keep wondering why we don't see a lot of people act according to such a common senses, especially important people. But anyway, so my question really is that, what would be the advice to the common people like us, like me, can do to improve the situation? And how the University of Minnesota can play a role to improve the relationship? Thank you.
Thanks. That's a really good question, and I think Ambassador, one thing I really liked about what he talked about, because he was talking about the importance of people at both the high level and at the ordinary level. That when you have a situation in which presidents don't meet and don't talk to each other, that's a problem. And that having the two presidents sit down in person for several hours, that's really important. But that is not enough. And I think one thing is, what can ordinary people do? Or, let's be honest, we're here at the University of Minnesota, so people who are interested in education and in building those ties can continue to try to do the work that there has been a lot of political pressure on over the last few years. And I know, Joan Brzezinski, who runs the U.S.-China Center, knows very well what that is. And I hope that there can be a calmness and a steadfastness in the importance of educational and research exchanges in the face of right now we're looking at those restrictions on semiconductors. And I think that things like contacting your members of Congress. So one is just maintaining personal and research and educational relationships and looking for ways that our universities, I know we have faculty here at the Humphrey School who are either from China originally or have deep ties to China and maintain those relationships with educational institutions in China. And I think that's really important. I think that groundwork is really important. I think that looking for ways to express to members of Congress. We just had this discussion in my foreign policy class the other day. We have somebody that works in a congressional office, and they pay attention when people write letters or call, and especially if there's something specific. So, making sure that the educational exchanges, the Fulbrights and things like that, there's such a huge array of federally funded educational exchange programs. We often loosely call them Fulbright, although many of them are not. There are other things. And I think that expressing to members of Congress your interest in supporting those are really important. And finally, the question about state level engagement, the state of Minnesota has over time also had governors, for example, and I know obviously with the pandemic that hasn't been possible, but is there a way for the state trade office or for individuals to learn more about what the state of Minnesota has in terms of engagement with China? That also can be there. And I don't think one person can change a relationship, but I do think that reaching out and including engaging with political leaders with your opinion is important because it doesn't always change their mind, but they do listen. So anyway, those are just some. I see some hands over on the other side there. These lights are really bright.
Good evening,
Hi.
Dr. Curtin. John Neville from Wells Fargo's Global Commercial Bank. Question for you is, what key risks do you see that we're not talking about that we absolutely should be talking about with regards to China and our relationship?
So risks that we're not talking about, I think well, one, there's a couple of risks um, that did kind of come up here. One of the things that was emphasized in the conversation here is the extent to which the government of China worries about internal stability. And when you read about the sort of drive for economic development through, the decades in China, a lot of that was focused on ensuring domestic stability within China. And there's a way in which every government in the world's first concern is domestic stability. Um, and including in the United States. And we don't always like to use that word in talking about ourselves, but we invest in people in the United States, we look out for their social welfare, all those kinds of things, because it's better to have a stable, prosperous country than not. But in China, over the decades, that concern with domestic stability has always been there. And a lot of people who look at China's external reach, for example, the Belt and Road Initiative or some of its other economic outreach initiatives over the decades, have looked at the motivation of the Chinese government as being, they see that external reach as being a way to help build their own prosperity. And so I think we often forget that is, that's something that, say, the experts here, they talk about that. But I think that's valuable to think about that. What ways is the Chinese government being motivated by that concern? I think that for me, someone that teaches and used to practice U.S. foreign policy, I think we still have a lot to be worried about the strength of our own democracy. I mean, we've seen it under attack violently, which is still shocking to think about. And to the extent that returns as a problem, if it does, then obviously that's going to hurt our ability as a country to undertake any kind of initiatives that will help keep peace in other regions or provide for our own stability. And so, domestic issues in foreign policy to me are always very important. Aside from that, I think that, the issues around military posturing on both sides, I think China, obviously under Xi Jinping, has adopted a very sort of aggressive sort of military push outward in the region. And the United States has had a tendency to respond and to do that, and which is one of the reasons why I think, again, this conversation between Xi Jinping and Biden was so important. And then finally, I think that this climate crisis and all its permutations are things also that I feel like we just don't really have a handle on where that could go. China's facing some really serious difficulties that, and yet is still, it's moved way really fast forward on green technology, but it's still very heavily dependent, for example, on coal. And I think that anytime we're thinking about things we're not thinking about, that putting climate crisis in there is probably a good idea. So hope that helps. Let's see, there's down here. Yeah, she's had her hand up for a while here.
Thank you. Hi. Thanks for this wonderful evening. This is really great. My name is Romy Slowiak. I'm with the Minnesota-China Friendship Garden Society. We're working on a wonderful China garden in St. Paul at Lake Phalen. If anybody hasn't seen it, we're here to invite you. But my question actually relates to a class in Chinese that I took here a while ago. And forgive me if you already touched on this, but it was at the Confucius Institute. And now the Confucius Institute is not here. I've heard lots of different explanations for that, and I wondered if you could shed a little bit of light on that.
I might ask Joan, would you be able to shed a light on that as head of the China Center? Otherwise, for me, I can give a sort of broad answer, but not the specific answer.
Thank you. Okay, so yes, I was the director of the Confucius Institute here at the University of Minnesota for its entirety. And I think two things happened really for the Confucius Institute. One, at the time that we decided to close, the US government was focusing pretty significantly on Confucius Institutes and their activities in the United States. But really in our own story, we had come on campus. You know, I don't know if you know, the University of Minnesota has a flagship program, a very strong Chinese language department that's been around since 1949, and a really strong Asian studies program. So when the Confucius Institute was open, it was really open to do outreach to the K-12 population. We saw in the K-12 population a number of things that we could do to boost the learning of Mandarin among our K-12 students and schools. And we worked to train teachers. A lot of the teachers were new to the country or new to the profession, so they just needed a lot of help. So at that time, after 10 years, we felt the field had really stabilized. Teachers were in good supply, they were trained well. Our efforts were kind of not as effective or as meaningful as they had been when we first opened. And so taking it to the next level, the Chinese partners weren't all that interested in it. So we were kind of at a road end, and we decided that it was a good time to cease our operations. At the same time, the National Department of Defense wrote into the National NDAA, the Defense Administration Act. No.
The National Defense Authorization Act, so
Sorry.
that's the spending bill.
Yeah, the spending bill that no university that received public funds from the DoD would, and had a Confucius Institute, would get those funds. So this university, given its research mission, also gets a lot of national funds from NIH and DoD. So it was a good time for us to close it, and we did. Thank you.
Okay, thanks. Thanks, Joan. Yeah, so, you know, I think that, you know, the broader issue is that these moments happen where where relationships like that can be, you know, politicized, and, you know, I'm of the mind that is not helpful. I mean, obviously, there is that concern about national security, but, you know, those things were really overblown. I remember when the U.S. ambassador to the UN, Linda Thomas Greenfield, was being confirmed to be U.S. ambassador, that she was grilled mercilessly about having made a comment about, you know, having ridden on a railroad that China built in Kenya, and, you know, how come we can't do that? And also about, I think, a Confucius Center in Louisiana that she's from, making a positive remark about it, and was grilled pretty mercilessly about that. Had nothing to do with her job. So, you know, unfortunately, that kind of rhetoric is still there, and I think we can see that. You know, I think we're not done with that, unfortunately. Let's see, I saw another hand up back here.
Thank you for your comments. You mentioned the railroad in Kenya. My question is around, China has done a lot of investment in parts of Africa and South America. And not only investments, but projects, and
Yes,
oftentimes
yeah.
bringing Chinese workers. Are we concerned about what the impact of that will be in terms of alignment of countries and U.S. trade?
Yes, the United States has been concerned about that for a long time, and there has been just a lot of discussion about why can't the United States do what China does. And we, part of it is the way that our aid is structured. Back in the 60s, the United States did used to build big projects. And for a lot of reasons, kind of got out of that and got more into building capacity and doing things like that. The reason, one of the reasons that and I would say that one of the big areas of attention has been in Africa. And to be honest, a lot of Africans complain and say, how about you think about us just because we're important and not because we're another field of competition with China? But the reality is, say, for example, people will say, well, why can't the United States direct, say, a U.S. construction company to build a freeway in this country? And it's because the United States government can't tell U.S. companies where to invest, right? U.S. companies invest, the United States can tell them not to invest someplace, but we don't have that kind of directed economy. And so it would have to be aid dollars that are appropriated by Congress and then spent in a very particular way. And so the United States is worried about that. We see that come out anytime there's, say, a vote in the United Nations where either China or Russia has influence in certain countries in ways that we, the United States, don't. And they also have historical influence, right? China supported the independence movements of a lot of countries in Africa, and they still remember that. And so the United States has a completely different type of assistance system and investment system. That means that we cannot, maybe we even wouldn't want to try to do something like the Belt and Road Initiative. So yes, it is something that policymakers in Washington think about a lot, but we don't necessarily have the kind of structure that would allow the United States to compete in exactly that same kind of way. It's a fascinating subject, how should the United States approach trade and investment and aid in a way that would allow it to have that kind of influence in the same way that China does. So I think we are going to wrap up. Thank you for all the great questions. I'm going to let Joan come up and wrap up here, but thank you so much.
Wow, what an evening. I think it was a really excellent discussion with Dr. Curtin. Thank you so much for being here, and really appreciate hearing John Huntsman speak to the U.S.-China relationship, giving his very extensive experience there. Thanks so much for coming. I hope you enjoy your evening, and we hope to see you again at one of our other programs. We have webinars going every month, and we probably will be at a couple of Chinese New Year events if you are. So hope that we see you soon. Thank you.